It's probably beholden on me to start by explaining what a futurist is, because inevitably that will come up in the questions at the end if I don't. If I can just knock off the first three questions to start with: no, I don't have a crystal ball. No, you're not going to get a jetpack anytime soon. And no, you can't have next week's lottery numbers. You'd be amazed how often those three questions come up. I'm what I call an applied futurist. I say what I call because it's sort of made up, if we're honest. My speaking coach tells me off for saying this, but since we're not in front of a bunch of corporates, I can say it. When I started or decided to be a futurist about 6 years ago, when I left my last startup, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I'd been writing about the future as Book of the Future since 2006. The Usborne Book of the Future was my favourite book as well. I still have, I meant to bring it with me actually, a rather threadbare copy falling to pieces that I consult on occasion. But I've been, as I say, I've been writing and broadcasting about the future since about 2006. If the voice and the strange name are familiar, I do a lot of stuff for the BBC on Channel 4, and, on Radio 4 and 5 Live and News Channel. And I was sort of being half booted out of my startup and half jumping out of it. Depends whether you ask me or the investors which way it was. And I needed to turn what was then a blog really into a career. So I sat down with a friend of mine who's a phenomenal branding guy, and a bit like Mark, beer is one of my favourite things. And so I sat down in the pub and gave him the brief, and I went to the pub, went to the bar and came back. And by the time I'd come back with the beers, he said, "You're an applied futurist." I said, "That's fantastic. What does it mean?" He said, "I have no idea." So we put this website together and said, I'm an applied futurist. And in the first month, I had phone calls from LG, Nikon and Sony Pictures saying, "We really need a futurist." And so I very quickly had to work out what it is. And 6 years on, I'm pleased to say it's an awful lot more professional than it was then. And really what I found is the questions I was being asked were not necessarily about the distant future. People were interested in what was going to happen in 20 years' time and beyond, and sometimes they get involved in that. But the things that they were really concerned about, the things that were the burning questions they had, were really about the next 5 years. They're about what's coming on the near horizon, what's going to take them out at the knees, or what's exciting them, what are the great opportunities. And so I've sort of set my stall out over the last 6 years now. I've been doing this full time, trying to help companies answer three questions. What does our future look like, with a particular view on it's narrowly devoted to them, and they're particularly focused on the near future, the next 18 months to 5 years. As I say, occasionally get involved in the 20-year stuff, but really about that near horizon. And once you've answered that question, they have a second question, which is, how do we tell that story? And sometimes telling that story is really important for their strategy. Sometimes it is writing their strategy. Sometimes it's about how do we tell our customers what the future looks like for us, because it looks very different to today. Sometimes it's about telling their staff, because the future may look very different for their staff. Sometimes answering that question is entirely frivolous. They come to me and say, if we're honest, we're a bit stuck for what to talk about in our marketing material. We've got no products and services coming up over the next year, and the future excites everybody. So can you help us talk about the future? And you know what? I'm not too proud to get involved in things like that. But the third thing, and the really tricky thing, the reason I call myself an applied futurist, the third question is, what do we do about it? How do we take that view of the future, that vision of the future, and that acceptance that things might take us out at the knees in the next 5 years, and change our organisation, change our processes to do things differently, to be more responsive? And that's really the meat of it, and kind of it's because what's become my mission over the next 6 years is to change the way our organisations behave. But I'm not going to talk a lot about that tonight. I'm going to talk about some much more fun stuff. This is a bit of a collected set of stories over a number of projects over the last couple of years that I thought might be interesting to an audience who are generally interested in digital. And it starts with a trip to Rome last week. It was my wife's 40th birthday last week, and I'm a hopeless romantic, so I surprised her with a trip to Rome. And the one properly tourist thing we did, we went to see the Sistine Chapel. And it reminded me, bizarrely, part of the conversation with Mark, of an experience from 15 years ago. So despite having a degree in mechatronic engineering, which is a real thing as well, just like futurism, I actually started my career in marketing. Funnily enough, Capgemini were one of the first clients I worked on. And back in about 2003, I was working for Real Networks. Who remembers Real Player? Who remembers cursing Real Player? Hideous piece of bloatware. Sorry! And I used to run the European PR for Real Networks. And the biggest launch I ever got involved with at any point in my sort of 5-year PR career was when the 5 major music labels finally realised that they had to do something about Napster. And not just take them to court, not just get it shut down, but actually try and build a sensible product for customers that provided an experience as good as Napster was offering for free. That was the lowest level hurdle they had to clear before they could really start to compete with illegal music sharing. And around that time, we used to talk about this idea with the Real Networks lot of the celestial jukebox. This idea that with streaming media, you could have access to all the world's music stored on somebody else's computer in a data center somewhere and stream it to your mobile device. And this was just such a far out concept back then. We were just getting used to having broadband, we were streaming bits of video, hadn't really taken off yet, nobody knew what the business model was. This was pre-iTunes doing downloads. This is when the best MP3 player was the Creative, I think it was called the Creative Sound Dock or something. This sort of giant, weird, ugly, shield-shaped thing that you had to use Windows Explorer to move music to. And this idea of the celestial jukebox seemed absolutely bizarre. And then you fast forward 15 years, who doesn't have an account with a streaming music service? 5 people. This is the norm now. And what it's done is really interesting. I do a lot of work in the property industry, big property companies, and at one point I was trying to explain to them the changing nature of, this was around the time that millennials was still a current term, and I was trying to explain the sort of hipster and millennial behaviour in terms of their working patterns, in terms of their living patterns. And I used my own cousins as an example, and I pointed out that my then sort of mid-20s cousins only really owned 3 things: a MacBook, a fixie, and a beard. And because of this, because of the offloading of all of their physical media to the cloud and to rental agreements, they basically owned nothing. Their entire houses had been shorn of the morass of magazines and DVDs and CDs or vinyl or tape before that. Mini disc. I still have a box of mini discs. And so the first part of the story I want to tell is about what technology's done in terms of actually stripping away so much of its physical presence in our lives. Our houses are increasingly empty of technology compared to where we were that 10, 15 years ago. And it's not just our homes, it's our workplaces as well. Sure, we've still got screens here and keyboards there and various bits and bobs. But you go into that Freedom Works, you go into any workspace now, and this number of single pieces of technology, the sheer volume of technology in there has dropped dramatically. I remember going to visit my dad's offices when I was a kid, and it was the day that they were swapping the mainframe for a mini computer. And the room that it was in was suddenly empty with this thing about the size of a washing machine in the corner. But they still had the PBX on the wall, the phone system. They still had faxes everywhere. When I started in PR, we still used to fax press releases to journalists. Some of them still insisted on them via post, which made timing announcements pretty tricky. If you go to any IT recycling centre now, just look at the stacks and stacks and stacks of beige boxes and monitors and faxes and printers and photocopiers and all the stuff that we just don't need anymore. So at home and at work, the physical presence of technology in our lives is being removed away, either completely because the device is defunct or because the physical media has been translated to digital and shifted to a cloud somewhere. And the hardware that's left just keeps getting smaller. We don't really talk about convergence anymore. Kind of talking about Moore's law and all these things has become a little bit old hat. But I remember in 2011 when I first got sent, I used to do some gadget reviews as well. I first got sent a Jawbone Jambox to review. And this was the first Bluetooth speaker that really nailed it. That didn't sound like you just stuck a pair of headphones on the end of a tin can. But it was genuinely competitive with a proper sound system. This sounded as good as maybe not a really good hi-fi, but that sort of £300 Iowa unit you got for your teenage bedroom if you were someone like me. It was staggering. I put it in the kitchen and it just filled the room with music. I took it into the radio studio and the DJs and the producers, people who worked it professionally with audio, were absolutely blown away by how it sounded. And it's this big. It's absolutely minuscule. And it was this for me, more than those, you've seen that GIF where somebody shows all the gadgets that we used to have condensed into the phone and the MacBook. It was the tiny size of this that really brought home to me just how much the technology in our lives is just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So lots of the physical presence is going away. What remains is getting smaller and smaller. Do people recognize this? Any remember what game this is? This is the first game I ever played on a computer on a BBC Micro in about 1980 something. It's Adventure, also known as Colossal Cave. And it's the first screen you see when you run that game. And for me, it's an important marker for me in my technological history. Fortunately, my dad was a geek as well, so there was always some sort of computing device in the home. But it illustrates what's happened to user interfaces over the last 30-something years that I've been using computers. Because rewind way back past this, rewind way back to the days of punched cards. And not even that far, to be fair. There's probably a few people in the room who use them. And think about how much effort a human being had to do to get at a computer to do what they wanted using a punched card. Think about how much preparation and pre-calculation and planning had to go in to basically taking the instructions you wanted a computer to follow and translating it into a series of holes punched out of a series of pieces of paper. And think about how much you desperately wanted to get that right when the entire company's payroll was depending on you getting it right. And redoing it would probably cost you your weekend because everyone wanted to get paid on Monday. In the early days of computing, the computer did a narrow set of the tasks. It did very little extrapolation from the information we gave it. You had to be utterly explicit. You had to speak the computer's language, a very alien language to us human beings. You fast forward a few years and you switch to the terminal, something that didn't look dissimilar to this. You're still having to give incredibly explicit instructions. To launch this game, I think we had to take chains, star, something or other, file name, etc., how to run it, where to run it, bang, bang, bang. You know, a string of characters, probably 30 characters long, just to run a simple text-based game. But look at the interactions. I have to think really hard about what I'm going to type. This isn't just dragging a joystick left or right. I've got a limited set of instructions that I can put in for it to make sense of. I'm working in its language. But it's better than the punched card. But it's not as good as what came a few years later. The GUI, point and click, icons that look like something I can recognize. Suddenly, some level of intuition about how to interact with this machine. The machine's taking some of that processing power and starting to do some of the work on my behalf, starting to speak my language, and saying, you don't have to do all the work. I'll use my processing power to do some of the work for you and make your life easier. Fast forward through stabbing your fat fingers on a touch screen to today, when I can shout across the kitchen and one time in two, Alexa will actually play the song I want on Spotify. And I don't have to shout, "Alexa, stop!" as I do so frequently. The physical aspect of so much of our technology is starting to be removed. What's there is shrinking, and what's there is getting easier and easier to use. Because the processing power we've developed, you're familiar with Moore's law in this room, I'm assuming. For those that aren't, over the last 50 years, the bang for buck we get out of a computer, this is my simplified version, the bang for buck we get out of a computer has been doubling every 2 years. And despite us bumping up against the limits of physics, that continues to happen because they continue to get cheaper. We've applied that incredible exponential increase in processing power, not just to doing more stuff, but to making it easier to do everything we do. The computer's starting to operate on our terms. It's learning our language. It's becoming intuitive. And suddenly, in order to operate a computer, you're not talking about a 4-year degree in computer science. You're talking about millions of years of evolution, because these things are becoming natural and part of the language we learn anyway. But something happens when we do this. When the technology starts to disappear, when it becomes too easy to use, we sort of forget what's going on under the hood. I mean, literally under the hood, knowledge is disappeared. Again, when I was a kid, I have vivid memory of my dad's Vauxhall Cavalier GLS 1600 on a cold day in Wolverhampton, where I grew up. If you can't tell the accent, it's because I spent a few years in London as well. Freezing cold day. And for some reason, it was a rare occasion, Dad was taking us to school. And he got out to the car and tried to start the engine, and it was having none of it. It would turn over, but it wouldn't fire. Dad swore a little bit, but got out the car, popped the bonnet up, went to the garage, got his socket set, pulled the spark plugs out, stuck them in the vise in the garage, got out his blowtorch, heated them all up till they were red hot, carried them back to the car wearing a pair of thick gardening gloves, screwed them back into the engine, and the car started. I don't know anybody who even knows how to get the plastic cover off their car engine these days, let alone how to whip out the spark plugs, and that was going to be the problem and that would fix it. But he'd grown up making things out of old Austin 7s. This was sort of second nature to him. I think we've got a generation now who've grown up with the technology equivalent of making things out of Austin 7s, hacking apart PCs, building stuff. But that's getting less and less common. The more reliable the technology gets, the less often we hack about. Lots of people I know who used to build their own PCs as teenagers now live on MacBooks that they never see the insides of. Those skills are starting to atrophy, they're starting to disappear. And this is what I mean by the end of digital. Digital technology is not going away. That would be daft. If anybody remembers Visionaries, Knights of the Magical Light, that was the entire premise of that 1980s cartoon show. Technology had gone away and magic had come back. I don't see that happening. But digital's starting to become invisible. It's being removed from our places of work and our homes. What's there is shrinking. And what's there is becoming so intuitive and so natural to use and so ubiquitous that we forget about it altogether. And at some point, following on from that Douglas Adams quote, we stop thinking about it as technology. It just becomes stuff. Now that's potentially interesting, but I think what's more interesting is what happens as that starts to happen. As this technology becomes so ubiquitous, so embedded in our lives, so natural and so integrated, what it does to the environment around us. And this is where I get into the parts where I start pulling things from different projects I've done. Say one of my sort of big client bases is in the property sector, where big constructors and consulting engineers and firms of architects and architecture schools and various others. And one of the really interesting prospects, I think. A way I've tried to build a narrative around what happens when all these technologies come together is this idea of the living city. We've all heard about smart cities, the progressive application of technology to the built environment, mostly to save money at the moment, if we're honest. A lot of the smart city projects that have been carried out around the world are to try and do things like bring down energy costs. Good for the environment, but primarily good for the council saving money. It's been about managing noise. It's been about how often do we have to empty bins. It's quite rudimentary, quite practical stuff, useful, but not necessarily wildly exciting from a technological point of view. Actually, most of the technology being deployed is 20, 30 years old. It's just that it's only being deployed now because the cost has come down so far. I actually built, I went to Santander, one of the very little heard of, but for me one of the most interesting smart city demonstrators in Europe a few years ago. And I caught some of the academics who'd been building this project, and it turns out most of the stuff they were knocking up was based on Arduinos. They'd just been buying Arduinos off the shelf and making all their own sensors. So each sensor node in this network, and they built, I'm trying to think how many they built now, a lot of them would probably cost less than £10. It was all off the shelf stuff. But you start to roll forward, you take this increasingly a grid of connectivity across the city, and you add that to sensing capability that's increasingly everywhere, whether that be cameras, temperature sensors, noise sensors, presence sensors, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth tracking. You take all these sensors together. You add to that increasingly the possibility for actually buildings to react physically. There's some fantastic videos online if you look for 3D printing buildings. My particular favourite is one from China, where a giant robot is 3D printing sheds inside a shed that is itself 3D printed. The sort of 3D printed Russian doll of buildings. You combine that technology, robotics, sensing, Internet of Things, connectivity, and add AI into the mix. And you start to think about what the city could be in the future. One that doesn't just sense what's going on and feed that information back, but that starts to respond to our needs as citizens, as workers, as commuters. So one example might be, imagine you've got a building that's got loads of stored heat at the end of the day. Maybe it's a Friday, the heat's going to do nothing over the course of the weekend. They're going to have to heat it up on a Monday anyway because all that heat's dissipated. But the building, through the network of the city, becomes aware of a bunch of people at the bus stop out the front, shivering. So the building vents its waste heat towards the bus stop to be a good citizen. Imagine down the side of that building there's a dark alleyway. For some reason the streetlights have gone out. And the building recognises, maybe from social data, maybe just because it recognises a dark alley is a bad thing, that it can throw on the desk lights along that bank of desks with the windows alongside that alleyway to light it up. Imagine the building looks at the patterns of behaviour of its users and starts to think, actually, this space isn't being well utilised. There's 20 people in this many square feet over here, but there's 10 people in this much square feet over here. I should reshape. The building has DNA at this point. When it's first been designed, encoded in its very nature by the architects who build it is DNA. This is the style of the building. This is what it looks like, how it operates, how it should feel. And it takes that DNA and mashes it up with this usage data and uses some sort of modular system or 3D printing to actually move the walls, move the doors to make better use of the space. All of that's starting to be possible and practical now, with very little human intervention. You mix into that the transport situation. We're a good probably 15 years off truly autonomous vehicles. I'd be interested on Callum's take on that, maybe more. But you can see how the transport mix starts to play into this. The buildings themselves become citizens and start to interact and share their resources, communicate with the transport network, and start to try and improve our lives, not just monitor it. A few years back I did a TEDx talk called We Are All Bionic Now. And this was very much along the same theme. I was pointing out that as a consequence of the user interface for our technologies getting better and better, the distance between us and our machines has got smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where we don't need to think about having some sort of neural lace to connect with our machines. We've already started to outsource cognitive functions to them. I was born basically without a sense of direction. It's a source of much hilarity to my wife, who does not understand how I can't spatially relate point A to point B, but I just can't. The advent of Google Maps was a godsend for me. I walk pretty much everywhere with a pair of headphones on, with a podcast and Google Maps telling me to go left or right. I even have a pair of shoes, I'm not wearing them today, that vibrate to tell me when to turn, left and right. And I'm not the only one. I mean, how many people now go somewhere unfamiliar without the aid of Google Maps or some equivalent? 3, 4. Try to. But then eventually we don't go back to... It's not just maps. How many people have taken photos of a slide already as an aide-memoire? You know, how many people are reliant on their calendar to know where they ought to be at any time? To-do list? Saved shopping list on Amazon or Sainsbury's Online or Waitrose? No, I'm not doing that one. I like Lidl, me. We started to outsource all of these functions to machines already, and I don't think we realise quite the extent to which we are already reliant on them. And it sort of comes out in those studies that say people are more attached to their phone than their wallet. I totally believe that, because even before I could pay for everything on my phone, I was utterly reliant on it. One of my favourite science fiction authors talked about this long before I thought we'd really understood it. Anyone read Charles Stross' Accelerando? It's free. If you haven't, I'd highly recommend it. You can go and get the ebook or buy it, but go and get it. And there's a great passage in it where the hero is mugged in Glasgow, I think, for his augmented reality glasses and wearable computer, to which he's outsourced a huge proportion of his cognitive functions. Digital agents operating autonomously based on his thought processes, but doing in search and communication and things on his behalf. And when he loses them, he literally loses half his mind, as does the mugger who tries to interface with it all. I think a very large number of us are pretty much, by any sensible definition, bionic already. We have outsourced a significant number of cognitive functions to machines, which may not be physically connected to us, but to which the interface now is so low friction, it might as well be. It's part of the reason I'm a skeptic about how soon we'll do any sort of direct neural interface. I just don't think we need it. Not to the extent we'll be willing to submit to surgery every 18 months when a new iPhone comes out. You would.
So, question I would have just now, so I'm reading a book called Life 3.0.
Ah, yeah.
Life 3.0. So, would you subscribe to that way of thinking where, we are software capability-wise, when we think about our minds, that we're able to update our own software, but when it comes to our hardware, we're not capable of producing what we need to kind of take ourselves to that next level?
I'll come back to that one. Short answer, I think we will start to radically alter our own hardware, but I think it's going to take a while for that to socially bed in.
Okay.
Can I just ask what that impact on your cognitive recall as developing adult? So in studies done where cognitive recall in children is less when they're exposed to technology, purely on the fundamental fact that the state that we're offloading that to technology.
It is, although the effects are still relatively small as I understand it. And actually they didn't measure any gained benefits in terms of other performance as well. So it's a question of how much cognitive recall is a valuable skill in the future. So if you believe that at some point there's going to be some hideous event that wipes out technology and we won't have it to rely on, it's a desperate issue that we start to lose that cognitive recall. But if you start from the basis that knowledge is increasingly commoditized, and what actually you need is the skill to rapidly suck in, process and utilize that information, then arguably we might be training people for more useful data sets from a career point of view, even if they are losing that sort of cognitive recall in terms of knowledge and stored knowledge. But I completely accept that behavior is going to shape the way your brain works. But you can,
two examples.
But you can look at what's lost, but you can also look at what's gained, and that's just the nature of evolution. We are constantly responding to our environment. One of the ways we are going to completely reshape the environment without touching the physical in the near future is mixed reality. I'm so convinced of the business case for this. And I say business case advisedly because I think this will be driven by the business case in large part. That the next natural evolution of our primary interface with technology becomes mixed reality. A pair of glasses probably to start with, maybe ultimately lenses, that permanently, and when I say permanently I mean 10 hours a day for most people probably, overlays a digital world on our physical world. Now that presents some potentially hideous visions as what that might look like. Pop-ups, ads, cookie acceptance tabs here and there. But actually there's a much more positive potential for what that looks like. Well, I say positive, neutral. In theory, every flat space could become a billboard, but it could become a space for art. It could be shifted into the colour spectrum that you like. Every clear space could have a virtual object or a virtual person in it. Actually, everything that you see that you don't like could be removed. Now, potentially that's nice. I really like walking down along the seaside. If I could remove the opposite side of the street when I'm in Manchester and replace it with the Croisette at Cannes or the seaside at Worthing, then that's great. But what if I'm in a, shall we say, a MAGA cap wearing voter in a Trump state? What if I start erasing people I don't like from my view? What if I start redesigning the people that I see? Overlaying everyone around me with some sort of avatar. Could be photorealistic. The potential for this is hugely disturbing, way beyond this idea of ads everywhere that most people seem to be concerned about. It's potentially isolating as well. If you are living in a reality that you've designed that is filtered to your tastes, the Facebook news bubbles we've been worried about will be the absolute least of our worries. But think about the scale of the business model for this. Think about that advertising potential. Think about that data. You are wearing permanently on your face a high-resolution camera that can capture everything you see, everything you do, and probably a set of emotional sensors, galvanic skin response, heart rate, breathing, and a microphone that build up a massive data set about the things you like, the things you enjoy, the things you've done. Exciting, potentially terrifying, depending on what business model works to support the processing power that goes behind this and the incredible technology we're wearing on our faces. And there are many, many different ways that could work. Some of them very positive, some of them very negative. But whatever happens, it will almost certainly be supported by what I've taken to calling the new PDA. I'm reclaiming this term. A new personal digital assistant. Call it AI, call it machine learning with knobs on. I'm a bit loose about the term AI. Computer scientists get very uptight about people misusing it. But the public, the people I'm usually communicating with, understand what you mean when you say artificial intelligence. They don't really understand machine learning. And yes, they conflate C3PO with a basic algorithm, but it's generally a more useful term. But imagine a fully personal assistant, not one owned by Amazon, not one operated by Apple on your behalf, but one that you own, probably existing in the cloud, but paid for by a subscription service by you. One that extracts all this information from your mixed reality headset, that pulls in all that visual data, all that emotional data, your shopping history, your social history, your location history, your work history, your Netflix streaming history, your Spotify playlists, how you reacted to the music you heard when you were about, how you reacted when you ate a different brand of cereal at your friend's house. Pulls all that information together and starts to make decisions on your behalf based on how it thinks you feel. I think we're not very far away of something like this. I'll give you a really basic example that few people would argue with. Who enjoys shopping for toilet roll? No good. No one wants to run out of toilet roll. No one enjoys shopping for toilet roll. You could have an Amazon dash button for it when you start to run out. Or you could have a camera that sees when you're running out and automatically orders more, and it's just there. Tins of tomatoes. I have two small girls who basically the only thing they will reliably eat is pasta and sauce. We go through a lot of tins of tomatoes. Running out on a Wednesday night when you really can't be bothered to try them on something else is a big pain. Camera, PDA, automatically ordered, never run out. I think we're a very short number of years of handing over discretionary credit card control up to a limit, within bounds, to a machine that starts to get to know us. And not just orders things by subscription, doesn't just order the same number of nappies every month, but starts to learn about what we might want and even orders treats for us based on the limits we set it. Your recommended purchases on Amazon taken to the nth degree. Swing back to a potential negative. If we've got to that level of artificial intelligence, that level of automation, then every single person in the workforce can do more. We're augmented by technology. But if every person can do more, maybe we need fewer people. This is a range of the estimates of how many jobs are susceptible to automation between now and 2030. No one's done to exactly the same date to make my life easy, so this is a little bit rough and ready. But it's all roughly to 2030. And they swing from the very conservative, potentially, the OECD at 14% of jobs. That's the conservative number, 14% of jobs susceptible to automation, through to 47% from the Martin School of Management at Oxford University. Even if you settle at the bottom of that range, or even somewhat below, we're talking about potentially an enormous number of jobs that might not be around anymore. And yes, there probably will be some new jobs. But it's really hard to see how there'll be as many as this sort of technology will likely wipe out. One of my clients is a London council borough. I helped them procure a piece of technology a couple of years ago. They were struggling to buy it because the procurement rules they were under basically said you have to compare this with something that's been bought before and something else that looks exactly like it. And no one else had bought anything that looked like it before, and it doesn't exactly have any direct competitors. But it's a piece of artificial intelligence call center technology. It answers every question or every call on the first ring. It answers 80% of questions first time. And in their context, most people calling it prefer dealing with it to a human being. They're dealing with rent arrears, tax arrears. People are embarrassed. No one wants to deal with a human in that context. But you know what? In lots of other contexts, people prefer dealing with a machine, an efficient, quick machine that answers straight away. We're not talking about one of those dial 9 and bang your head against a brick wall IVR systems. We're talking about a proper, emotionally intelligent system. 80% of calls, it can answer itself. We employ 1 million people in call centres in the UK. Not all of them are going to go, but a fair proportion. The retail industry reckon it's going to shed 1.2 million people. The legal industry's largely got its head in the sand about how many lawyers we actually need. It's significantly fewer than we have now. And if you speak to the management boards and the senior partners in most big law firms, as I get to do, they're on it. They know it. They're mainly trying to work out how, if their business goes from being shaped like that, with loads of junior partners at the bottom, to being shaped like that, with some junior partners and a bunch of robots, or maybe even being shaped like that, with more senior people than junior, because 90% of the work can be done by robots. How on earth do they have a career ladder? How on earth do they get anybody in at the bottom? How on earth do they find the people who are going to be tomorrow's partners who are going to buy them out?
They just sue each other.
Lawyers are very good at creating work. But the same is true for accountants, the same is true for the logistics industry, the same is true for everybody driving. There's a huge amount of potential here for stuff to go. I don't see anywhere near as much potential for new work. Interesting work, yes. High value work, yes. Mass work, not so much. There's also a really interesting threat from a security perspective. So one of my clients is Mcafee, the antivirus company. They asked me out to Paris earlier this year to go and talk to an audience of journalists about the future of security. It's funny because the chief science officer of Mcafee and I disagree on everything, but get on really well. It makes for a great debate. But I threw some ideas at them about what the future of security might look like in a world where some of these technologies have been realised. Think about your job when everyone in your business is reliant on technology to augment them beyond where they are today. Imagine that when you apply for a job, you having some of that technology inbuilt or available is part of the application process. Just like as a freelancer, and more of us will be, you're expected to have your MacBook. Maybe it's some sort of design co-processor, an AI assistant that speeds up your work. Now imagine what happens if that gets attacked by some sort of malware. I can't come in today, I've got a virus. Does that count as a sick day? Imagine that your memories are increasingly augmented by live video, storing footage. Maybe it's got some sort of metadata tagging to really augment your memory based on the video and the audio it captures. Now imagine someone breaks into the cloud vault that's stored and deletes a load of files. Is that vandalism or is it assault? The more we become reliant on these technologies, the more they become invisible, the less we talk about them, the more they become embedded in our lives, the more potential threats there are, the more security risks, and the fewer of us there might be who can actually tackle them. There's also the issue of control. This is my favourite theme park ride. It's at a German theme park which I can barely pronounce, called Trittstrill. This is the Höhenflug. My wife's German, I really ought to speak better German. But she speaks, so I just shut up when we go on holiday, it's great. On this ride, you get into a sort of aeroplane and you have two wings on handles that you can flip up and down like this. And if you flip them up and down at the right time, you can get the whole aeroplane to spin round. And you get points for spinning. And if you get really good at it, and I probably did this thing 6 times in a row, you find yourself going round and round and round and round and round and round until you feel very sick. I should not have had that much candy floss. But fundamentally, your entire trajectory is controlled by the ride. You're making yourself spin or not, but you're going up and you're going down and you're going up and you're going down. You have an illusion of control. And my concern about this, when you combine that technology, when you combine that disappearance into the background, when you combine that loss of the knowledge about how it works under the hood, we find ourselves quite rapidly in a situation where we have an illusion of control. We can tweak things here and there, but a lot of stuff's happening behind the scenes. Now, if we own the mechanisms and the algorithms that are driving this ride, I'm not sure how much that's a problem. If they really are responsive to what we want and what we like, and they really do understand us, and they're an extension of ourselves, and they're accessible to everybody, another issue, then I'm not sure how much that's a problem. But if Amazon's flying the ride, if Amazon's controlling the direction, or Google or Facebook, I think we have to at least be conscious of why it's flying the way that it is. There's a number of things we have to do, and then things we have to start doing now about the potential for these technologies in the direction of travel. The inclination of some people is just to resist. I don't like technology. I don't want this. I'm stepping back from that. And this ranges from the entirely legitimate, getting off Facebook, to trying to extract yourself from the world, the modern world. And I don't really buy that argument. There are people trying to live off-grid, outside of the modern technology, claiming that we've made things worse. I had a genuine conversation with someone that they thought technology had made things worse rather than better over the last 2,000 years. I'm like, what are your objective measurements of better? Is it how long people live? Is it how long people live healthily? Is it how much violence there is? How many people die a violent death? Because if you take technology in the broadest sense, it's pretty hard to argue that it hasn't improved us on all those metrics. We may have done some damage to the planet in the process, but the human race is rather better off than it was. We're a race of tool makers. We're defined by this capability. We have been since 350,000 years ago, when whatever his name is, Australopithecus afarensis. I went to a comprehensive, we didn't do Latin. First picked up a rock and stoved in the head of the animal he was chasing rather than trying to do it with his fists. We're a race of tool makers, we're defined by it. And I think trying to step away from that is probably the wrong answer. But I do think we have a responsibility to start to change the way we educate people about technology. And I don't necessarily mean teaching everybody to code. You know, it's fun and it's noble, and yes, you probably are giving people a better career prospect if you get their hands on a Raspberry Pi early. But I think starting to teach people about the way that technology is propelling our society, the way that it's inevitably changing our behavior, the way it's shifting power around society, I think the level of literacy in that is probably much more valuable. And I think a serious political conversation about what that means for our economy in the next few years is incredibly important. And it's not really happening. There was meant to be a government commission looking at this. I think it was originally meant to start sitting in 2016. I think it may have started sitting in 2018, and I haven't really heard an awful lot about it. They're caught up in all sorts of other things, like the B word. But if you talk to my clients, Brexit's not the top of their list of concerns. So a day or two after the vote, I was doing some work for the big German conglomerate, BASF. I had a room of maybe 300 salespeople from that company. A company that manufactures in Germany, imports to the UK. A company that was quite possibly going to have to recertify all its products, redo all its pricing, was facing potentially massive increases in tariffs. And I prepared a talk that was about to tell them that technology was the biggest driver of change. And I took their head of foresight aside, they're big enough to have a head of foresight, an ex-BP guy, and said, look, I'm a bit worried about this. I'm about to stand up in front of all your people in the face of Brexit and tell them that technology is the biggest driver of change. And he said, don't worry, we absolutely agree. From board level down, technology, Brexit somewhere third, fourth, somewhere down there. It's what our strategic planning is based on. the threats that we're looking for, the competition we're looking at, the demand for our products is all driven by changes in technology. I think it's also important to say we kind of ain't seen nothing yet. And we occasionally fall into that Victorian trap of thinking we've invented everything. Another good quote from a science fiction author, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed, which anybody who rides the rail network knows all too well. There's loads of stuff we haven't even touched yet. And there's loads of technology coming around the corner that's going to be utterly transformative again. What impact quantum computing has, we have no idea yet. Does it break all cryptography? Possibly. That could be interesting. What happens to your bitcoins then? Potentially. What happens at the nanoscale? So one of my jobs is as the resident futurist at the National Graphene Institute. And I'm off there, well, would be off there tomorrow if I got back from here in time, but probably in a couple of weeks. And I get to go and listen to these incredible physicists and everything they're working on. And I'm still learning the vocabulary, to be honest. Like, to even understand the conversation, you have to learn a new vocabulary. But the stuff that is coming out of there is utterly mind-boggling. Like, we have an idea of matter, we think of, you have an idea that if you're going to make a chair, the legs probably have to be that thick. If it's going to take your weight, it has to be a certain size. And they have the potential to just tear all those rules up. If digital technologies change the way the world works, what's coming out of materials technology is going to change the way the world looks. Fundamentally reshape. All those sci-fi visions we all saw, potentially come true. Because if you look out there now, it looks pretty recognizable to anybody from about the 1930s onwards, if not before. And biotech. I think people often overestimate how much we really understand about the human body, particularly the brain. We are still absolute novices in terms of understanding our own biology. We've come an awful long way in terms of extending life and improving life. We can go an awful lot further. But every time we think we've cracked it, it's a bit like climbing a mountain and coming over a peak thinking you're at the top. Suddenly further away again. But the rate at which we're learning is increasing. That exponential increase in technological capability is being applied to this problem all the time. We're underfunding it. Brexit's not going to help. But you can expect some enormous advances in terms of our understanding of our own biology in the next few years. And how we might apply that is going to be absolutely fascinating as well. So, before I sum up, I'll take a break for some questions, and I will open the floor up. Are there any women who'd like to ask the first question? Because it's so often men. I won't force you. I won't force you. No?
You talked about the illusion of control, which reminded me of the illusion of connection. So, to give you an example, my wife is French, my attitude is French, a little bit like your attitude is German. And when my daughter was probably 18 months, 2 years old, we were on a Skype video call to her grandparents in Paris. And from across the room, she spotted her grandmother, who she knew, she'd met, she'd spent time with. And she launched herself across the room, a huge smile on her face. And as she got closer to the screen, something obviously clicked, where she realised that that person was not in the room, and she burst into tears. And so for me that was like, okay, so this stuff looks like reality, but it's missing these really key biological cues that we have evolved to feed off of, pheromonal cues, subtle body language, things that you lose through the frame rate and so on. So I suppose, what have you got to say about that in terms of...
So that brings up a really interesting point about the richness of reality. There's a huge obsession. The thing I probably spend most time talking about on the telly is, are we losing our kids to technology? Oh dear, it's dreadful. And actually, you come back to that Douglas Adams quote that Mark put up at the front. Look at the behaviour of those three age groups in terms of their use of technology, and particularly social media. There's the over 35s, or the dominant Facebook users as they are now. But look at that middle group, for whom social media was new and exciting and novel, and they jumped in with both feet and no cares in the world. And then look at the youngest group and how they use it. Look at the rise of the networks they choose to use. Look at their behaviours on it. I observe those people and I see that they use technology to organise meetings in physical space, capture those meetings in physical space while they're there, and talk about those meetings in physical space after the fact. They are the drivers of the experience economy. They may be obsessed with sharing that experience on Instagram, but most of their digital interactions are about driving more physical interactions, whether it's the most explicit on Tinder or much less explicit elsewhere. And so I think there is a definite generational shift in terms of our attitude to that connection, recognising that digital is no substitute for the physical. It is miles off being a substitute for the physical. Even the best virtual reality headsets are a mile off jumping on the Hohenflug and being flung round in the air at God knows how many miles an hour. And I think there is a recognition of that now, which is being seen in all sorts of things. Going back to music, where I started, I think that's a really interesting one. In parallel with the rise of digital music, which made music less of an interaction, more ephemeral, just almost music becomes muzak because it's just there and I can get it whenever I want it. And it's just, that's just whatever Spotify's put on for me. In parallel, the rise of vinyl sales, albeit to a small section of the population, but more importantly, the rise of live music. And live music sales and revenues went absolutely through the roof in parallel with that. And I think this sort of digital physical thing, there is a real 80-20 law where the more of our lives that are sort of digital and ephemeral and automatic, the more we value the physical and the visceral and the tactile and the really human stuff. I think your daughter in some ways was possibly expressing that. I really want the physical interaction. Yeah. I get the digital all the time.
I think there was a country in Asia where they recently had access to Facebook, whereas Western society has pictures of what they did the weekend, they used it for political movement. It's that construct environment which it gets used.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. Alongside all of the cat pics and your posh dinner, there is an enormous amount of political activity happening on social networks here as well, and in the US. Not all of it positive, depending on your perspective, but they have been from day one. It's why the police wanted to shut down BBM during the riots in Manchester, because really it was being used as a tool for political activism. Question there?
Yeah, do you think that there's a risk that we're just becoming too dependent, too reliant on technology? I mean, I've got kids, if I want to find them, I turn the Wi-Fi off. They just don't know what to do with themselves almost, that digital connection.
That's interesting. I mean, it's too reliant, Do we expect chairs to suddenly stop working? Do we expect the laws of physics to change? What could actually rip the rug out from underneath us? Nuclear war, basically. I mean, that's the threat. Some sort of EMP burst wipes out computing for a large extent. So then it comes down to if we're not worried about it actually going away, then is it a purely social ill? Is it a social ill that we've become increasingly reliant on this technology? And from a skills standpoint, I don't think it is. I think it's shifting our skills base towards things that are more suited to the future. But it's not. And absolutely, we're losing skills, we're losing knowledge, we're losing capability. But I don't necessarily think for the negative. I think that's natural. Just like I don't know how to darn my own socks anymore, whereas my granddad used to. But in terms of social interaction, I think there is a case to be made that particularly for a couple of generations, and I don't know how old your kids are, but for a couple of generations, the novelty of the screen and the digital interaction pulled people away from the physical. I absolutely see it going back in the other direction again. because while we've progressively had time to adapt and they've sort of learned their lesson of their older brothers and sisters and actually their parents as well. But if my kids are very young, and if they had the opportunity to dive into their phone at most opportunities, they probably would. But I don't know how long that lasts. I think that richness of that physical interaction and the tactility and the thrill starts to overtake it again. I think the novelty wears off and it becomes just stuff. So yeah, I'm not too worried, to be honest. I certainly don't buy the ideas that the largely unscientific ideas that this technology is doing permanent damage to our kids.
Could the end of digital come about because of a lack of physical resources?
Physical?
Metals, etc.
What, sorry?
Metals, etc. Are Apple stockpiling stuff?
Yeah, although again, the stuff in the labs is already starting to get us around this. So batteries is a good example. Lithium-ion batteries require a rare, explosive, quite unpleasant resource and various other bits like cadmium and all sorts of other stuff. All the batteries in the labs use aluminium. Cheap, ubiquitous, much safer, and actually can be made with a higher energy density than the lithium-ion. So I think generally science will find us a way around those issues. I'd like to see us switching to cleaner technologies an awful lot faster. It's one of my great disappointments that in the UK and Ireland, where we control, we've got loads of wind power, loads of wave power, and we've got a relatively limited geography. We could have been early adopters of green energy so much quicker. If you'd taken some of the enormous subsidies we give to other forms of fuel and shifted them over 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but we didn't. I think between recycling and I think switching to more ubiquitous materials, we'll probably get around that. I don't think that asteroid mining is going to be used to bring an awful lot of stuff. Planetary Resources, I think, have raised now worth like $4.5 billion. A company did set up for asteroid mining. I think they'll mostly be actually mining ice and turning it into space fuel, like rocket fuel. Excuse me, as you might tell, I'm still getting over a bit of a cold.
Can I just ask a question about the emotional impact on all of this? Because we talked about technology, changing people's lives, etc., but your comment about the PDA, and I like you taking about the idea of the PDA, was interesting, but we're familiar with the idea of being in an echo chamber to do with news, and an echo chamber to do with maybe who our friends are. That suggests that you might end up in an echo chamber to do with your emotional reactions to things. And you know what I mean? If it's kind of saying, well, you like this, you blushed at that, so you didn't like it, so I won't show that to you again. Well, that's a nice feeling because I've measured the levels of over the hormone when you're happy. In your bloodstream, what do you think about that effect on you?
I think it's a huge possibility. It's Twitter mute on a grand scale, And I think it's an absolutely serious risk. I mean, again, you've always got to sort of counterweight these things. If you look at, rewind to youth culture, from when I was young, and back, it was indie kids and ravers for me. The choice at my school was entirely, it wasn't binary, it was trinary. You were an indie kid with your German army shirt, your Doc Martens, your black jeans. You were a raver with your Reebok Classics and your bag of Rat Pack tapes. Or you were neither, which was the worst of both worlds. I'll let you guess which one I was. Rewind before that, your mods and new rockers, everything else. We always had quite a binary youth culture. And you talk to someone, talk to your kids now about this idea that they would have chosen one of two tribes. I think they'd find that anathema. I don't know how old they are, but you talk to most teenagers now and they don't recognise that at all because their social grouping is not defined by geography anymore. They find themselves part of global tribes where they like this game, but this music and this food and these comics and these stories and this sport and these clothes. And they assemble their own identity out of all of these different global groupings that they're part of. And so in some ways, our experience in terms of emotion, in terms of cultural influence else is much broader than it used to be. I think we just confined ourselves in different ways. But absolutely, in some ways, it's much narrower. It's much easier just to turn off those things that offend and challenge your perspective. And I think we've already seen how damaging that is. I remember I listened to an LSE podcast just after Trump was elected, and they had a woman on the panel. I'm trying to think who it was now, and she said, I've got family who are dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, and dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. And neither of them can understand how on earth the other can vote the way they did, because they're both operating on completely different evidence sets about what reality looks like. And I think that's an absolutely huge risk. You know, I wrote a blog post about this about a while about, you know, is our society becoming more diverse or more fractured? And I think without those, without actually shared touch points, cultural touch points, social touch points, shared reality, shared facts, it's a huge risk.
That's always been the case, though, isn't it? That's not to do with technology. I think that's to do with human behaviour, isn't it? Because we always shut out things we don't want to listen to.
Absolutely, but I think we have much greater access to things we do like now, and a much greater ability to shut down things we don't.
Choose to watch. Well, some people still choose to watch Fox News all day.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But you would say that's crazy, but actually that's what they choose to do.
Yeah.
I think
But
that's
there's a difference between switching something off because it offends you and using your technology in the future to not be offended by things because you don't like the experience of being offended.
Sorry, I've had someone waiting for a while.
You mentioned how music had exploded. Interesting enough, though, music at the very top, like the O2s of this world, the Glastonbury's has exploded, but music down at the bottom level has actually collapsed at the level of pubs. And what's happened is that music has become concentrated in the hands of a few, such as Live Nation. In the world of retailing, it's become concentrated in the hands of Amazon. In the field of food delivery, it's become concentrated in the likes of Just Eat, and so on and so forth. The effect of the digital economy means that, and no need to have bricks and mortar means that companies can literally take over the world. They can base themselves in jurisdictions where they don't get any control. Is the desperate need to regulate this capitalism ever more than before? Is that something that your clients like to discuss?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, Amazon is both equally popular and unpopular with most of my clients. Most of them see it as a threat. Most of my clients, bear in mind, they're quite established companies, often in heavily regulated markets. They would love to see more regulation of Amazon. Bear in mind, the people who lobby most for regulation are typically big companies. It's often not unions or anybody else. Big companies love regulation because it locks out competition quite a lot of the time. So if you look at the amount of money, someone like BT spends pushing for greater regulation of the telecoms market because it makes the barriers to entry that much higher. Same with banking. You know, the banking industry probably hates the FCA at the moment because they've been quite receptive to new startups coming in.
Do you feel like regulation is adequate at the moment?
No.
It seems to me that it's absolutely frightening because countries will not get together to create a global
The single thing that's the most inadequate on that footing at the moment is taxation. Because we have failed to cooperate internationally to enforce reasonable levels of taxation on those companies, they operate at a massive advantage over local competition, who are much more heavily controlled and prosecuted from a tax perspective. There are other regulations you probably want to look at as well in terms of employment law, etc. But taxation's the primary one. Like we have failed miserably to tax those companies properly. And that alone reduces some of the stranglehold and their ability to outperform other companies. But it's not just that. You know, some of our local competition utterly failed to recognise what was coming and make themselves a reasonable competitors to some of the inbound competition from Silicon Valley. And that's kind of what I come from a startup background. That was my last business. But I like established companies. Established companies generally behave better. They generally have better labour relations. They generally pay better. They have a lot of stored goodwill and strong brands. But they're absolutely crap at changing themselves to fit with what the world's doing. And I'd love to save more established companies rather than see them disrupted by Schumpeter's Gale, because what comes afterwards is quite often not better for a lot of us. How are we doing for time?
I think that's a really good place. Maybe one more question.
One more?
Yeah.
Let me take those. Give me all four and I'll try and combine them quickly.
Okay, great talk. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on digital regulations in the future. Is it a myth? Is it possible? Like humanise regulation?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, okay, I'm worried about your intelligent city, your living city. What's to stop? Sometimes the building will blow the hot air on the bus stop, but not if you're not a member of some
Cool.
So
Digital regulation.
what do you know? Do you believe that this is going to, that the digital world will become more equal or more diverse?
Okay, rights, equality.
Robotics. I find the whole conversation about us losing our jobs to the robots really depressing. It's like, where did we let go of the reins on this? The robots should be serving us. We should be in a position to be saying, actually, we don't have to work so much anymore.
Yeah.
How can we make that work for us?
I'll give you a get out on this, but you don't have to answer. You've got a fairly bleak picture, I think, of the inevitability of the digital tail wagging the wet dog, as it were. But yet you've conceded that actually that physical and presence with people is something that is always going to be there. So my question is, do you actually, is this what you believe is the future, or is this your pitch? Is this something you can sell?
So I'll start with that one. I'm a long-term optimist, short-term pessimist. I think generally as a race we're pretty good at building a better future for ourselves, but there are always really difficult periods, and I see the next 20 years particularly as being a really tough period. I think we're not prepared for the automation piece and for the robotics piece. You know, where do we let go of the reins on that? You could argue capitalism. I mean, yeah, if anybody's read Adam Smith, and then read what comes out of the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute for Economic Ideas. You know, there is a huge difference between this sort of this idea of constrained, responsible, small business owners, setting out on, with enterprising ideas about how they can change the world, and giant-scale corporatism leveraging huge amounts of finance to crush all the competition and workers' rights in the process. So where did we lose the reins? When we stopped controlling, actually, regulate, we let the invisible hand run free rather than constraining it. And I think we've got to get back to a much greater level of constraint. I don't believe the state should do everything. I don't believe markets should do everything. I think there's a really good balance somewhere between the two, and we're far too far in one direction at the moment. In terms of your city piece, the risk is absolutely that at the moment this becomes a subscription service, and if you have your subscription, you get the warm air, and if you don't, you don't.
Yeah, you might get the light, or you might get tasered.
Right, and if you look at what's happening with spaces that are increasingly being privatised in our cities, you walk down the Thames around the PwC offices, and that's all private land. Some of the best views of Tower Bridge are all private land now. Same in the big business districts in Manchester, all private land. That absolutely worries me, and I think again there is a lack of political discourse amongst the general public beyond sort of narrow circles about that sort of issue, which I think definitely needs to increase. Which comes back to your rights question: is digital rights, digital human rights, a possibility? Despite the current negative trends of protectionism and wall building and leaving the European Union, the grand arc of human history is the shrinking planet and an increasingly common and communicative and shared race with an increasingly shared set of rights. And it is the digital platforms which bring us closest together at the moment. And so I don't think it'll happen soon. This is my long-term optimist rather than my short-term pessimist talking. But absolutely, I can see that being almost a platform for a universal set of rights at some point, but it's a way off. Cool. It's a good place to leave, I think. Thanks very much.